Here's a topic for discussion. Who does what in your organization and how is that decided? It seems like a simple enough question, but it's fraught with issues of cooperation and leadership. Do people choose what to do themselves, driven, say, by curiosity or by perceived need? Do we assign a workhorse with a pilot or a manager to steer the process, to drive it? Do we hand a person the reins themselves? Who really makes decisions? Of course, we all make decisions all the time, but it gets harder when there are more stakeholders involved. And this is where leadership becomes important. It's not the same as managing a play. It's not placing orders or ticking boxes. Without leadership to offer direction and to align interests, having a vision or a mission in business speak, a lot of initiatives will quickly languish through indecision, perhaps to avoid conflict. Personality plays a role too. Some of us are bubbling, fizzing, eager to make change. Others are more comfortable with the status quo in a settled state. Do not disturb. Leave me to my cubicle, to my own pace. So these are some of the factors in making progress towards change. Here's a phrase that we hear from time to time. I want you to take ownership of this problem. Also the opposite. I'm making this your job. Is that an invitation or a threat? The answer isn't obvious from the words alone. Taking ownership is meant as a form of encouragement to act, often in an environment where autonomy is valued. But is the way clear to taking ownership? And what does it really imply? Is assigning a role real ownership, or is it just some semantic sugar for a directed command? A manager might say, don't wait for me to tell you what to do, just go for it. But then would we be blocked at the last moment? Are people invited to the strategy table that might suddenly be, overturn their decision, betrayed at the finishing line? So what does all this mean? Leadership and authority can lead to a lot of mixed messages. Can decision rights be assigned, or do they have to be won? Is attempted assignment not ownership, but merely permission to engage? And where does the authority to grant that permission actually come from? Who really has it? There are cultural issues here of interpretation and context. Go for it, or that's not how we do things here. Autonomy and ownership turn out to be pretty muddled concepts. We're born free and, in principle, autonomous, but at the same time, we're born into a framework that we may have relatively little choice but to accept, at least if we want to make progress along with others. And when we join an enterprise, we probably do so on the understanding of having a certain empowerment, of having certain decision rights. But ownership of something in society is usually understood as an exclusive right to decide over property. So these words are kind of tricky. Leadership, on the other hand, assumes having followers. It has to be won, earned. Shared ownership is possible, of course, but it might need a vote or some consensus to work. So the norm is often to try to work around these ambiguities in management by trying to impose hierarchical design rather than gradually winning favor and earning respect. Sometimes it gives short-term wins, but often the problem ends up being harder than we thought. Holding on to that autonomy in a situation of collaboration means dealing with difference and even conflict. Is conflict ever a good thing? Surely we need to align, but we also need to question directions. So someone has to voluntarily cede or compromise their autonomy in order to resolve differences. Strong personalities quite often win the final rights to decide, because otherwise they just pack up and leave the collaboration altogether. But compromise needs a certain humility which can be sabotaged through this miscommunication or too much strong personality. And then the feeling of being slighted or disrespected gets in the way of reaching that final equilibrium. Owners in the property sense are not always directly involved even. A board of governors, directors, shareholders, they may make decisions that are recognized legally as having the final word, yet they may have very little understanding of the situation or even involvement in the process. Actually, the last word usually belongs to society, to laws and to governance, at least if you're lucky enough to have that kind of thing. In shared control, voting is often used to help us gauge alignment in large numbers, even used as a deciding protocol. But for small numbers, it might actually be divisive. Voting doesn't force anyone to accept the outcome of the vote, so that willingness to accept the vote has to be won, based on trust and respect. So to the phrase taking ownership, no one really takes ownership unless they buy, steal, or conquer by force, foregoing trust altogether. Promise theory reminds us that we have to promise our intentions as a kind of service to the stakeholders, because by making our intentions clear, we find ways to cooperate. Take it or leave it, in a way. But for every offer of a promise, there has to be acceptance in order for it to matter. If I offer you blue, but you only accept red, there's no cooperative progress. When imposing without aligning or having a willingness to listen, we can end up in tit-for-tat, do-undo cycles of conflict. At least to hurt feelings and damaged relationships. And this is one version of the tragedy of commons. So, this is where trust and leadership come into the picture. Too much trust, and there may be no perceived need for communication at all, but then no alignment either, just unquestioning acceptance until it collapses. Too little trust, and everyone has to be checking everyone else's homework. This creates a bottleneck, slowness, mistrust, and a cycle of resentment. This is interesting. It means that deciding isn't leadership unless it's actually accepted. An appointed leader has to become trusted by being seen to keep their promises. And that appointed leader may therefore have a tougher struggle to build relationships with followers than one who emerges naturally. So what does all this mean for governing a project? Who gets to decide work, assign it? Why would anyone accept those decisions? How can we combine multiple individuals into overlapping roles to scale up operations? If we get this wrong, there can be a loss of goodwill. Tie a co-worker's hands. We can put up hurdles for people to jump over. This undermines trust, which is the basis of all cooperation, all exchange. What we see is that the basic ingredients of decision-making are actually trust and respect, far more so than competence, because competence can only be judged by someone else who is competent. And in the end, trial and error, decision-making, like short, self-correcting OODA loops, could be the answer to that. Deming taught us to invest in strong, singular relationships rather than play people off against one another in competition, because trust ensures ongoing resilience, future guarantees or future promises, which is more important than that momentary assurance or progress. So let's end by framing these questions. How should we share decisions and schedule our workforce? How can we build realistic trust and respect for true cooperation? How do we create stability, conflict-free parallelism, and human interoperability? And then finally, how do we judge success and encourage our own self-correction? My experience is that understanding the flow of decision rights is of crucial importance in an organization, and that nearly everyone has fixed and often narrow ideas about how this should work. Alignment's not easy, there's a first mover advantage. If we value individuality too much, we can undermine the basis for cooperation and therefore leadership. We can only really lead if there are followers, if there's voluntary subordination. People may think they agree with one another, they may even use the same words with different meanings. And it can take a while for that commons to turn tragedy back into a society that works collaboratively and together. So let's discuss these issues and see if we can find an alignment